This morning is a little bit about training and some of the recent scientific publications that have been done by our group in Liverpool and in some cases other groups around the world that I hope are starting to help inform our preparation of players. Now, it seems to have taken a long time for the World Cup to come to the African continent. And as Richard said, it's great to see all the excitement in South Africa ahead of the games that are due to start on Friday. Probably the advances in the sport have helped the global appeal. And certainly back in 1930, when the first World Cup was held in Uruguay, it was probably unthinkable that at that time there would be a tournament of this magnitude in the African continent. But as the global appeal of the games developed, so have the demands and the training of the players. And probably it is those scientific advances and the input from coaches that have made the sport truly global now. So what I'll try and cover then over the next 40 minutes or so is a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the recent advances that we have in soccer training. But for me, before we can start talking about training, we need to understand a little bit about the demands of the game. So I'll spend a little bit of time just talking about what we know about what happens in a football match. And then I'll move on to try and contextualise that information by talking about how we prepare players and look at some of the particular problems that we face when we're training players, especially in the European leagues. And then I'll finish with a bit of a summary. So hopefully, I know there's a lot of people in the audience who are incredibly knowledgeable in this area already, both from a scientific and a practical point of view, but I'd hope that over the next 40 minutes or so at least, there'll be something for everyone in my presentation. Whenever I'm thinking about training players, I always think of it in this context. And this was a schematic that's based around the paper that Professor Tom Riley wrote in 2005. Unfortunately, Tom's no longer with us, but he did start his career as an ergonomist, which is all about trying to fit the person to the task. And so I think this model gives us a really good framework with which to start thinking about soccer training. So now we can see the importance of understanding the game, because if we can understand what players do here, then we can start to understand their direct fitness requirements. And those fitness requirements will help us gear the training process, so determine what players should actually be doing in sessions, but may also help us select the team in order to ensure that our club's more successful. So everything I'll talk about today really was in the context of this model, because I think it's very important to see it as a holistic process. So what do we know about football? Well, there's been an awful lot of publications in the scientific literature now that helps us determine what players do in matches. Thought it'd be useful really just to give a little bit of a historical context to this data before I talk about some of the more innovative approaches that are happening around the world now. The techniques were in some cases pioneered in Liverpool back in 1975 at this ground, which is the home of Everton Football Club. And at the time what was happening was that people were sitting in the stands and they were specifically focusing on one player. And they were trying to code the activity of that one player either with an audio tape recorder or with a video recorder. Now, it's not a very exciting way to watch a football match because you don't actually see very much of what's going on in the game, just focusing on one individual. But when you do take the information back to the university or the club and you analyse it either with a computer system or with some kind of paper-based hand notation method, we can get information on things like the distance that players travel and also the time that players spend in different activities. And we can start to create these type of activity profiles, which I'm sure a lot of you will have seen. Players will cover around 10,000 metres in a game, maybe a little bit more now because this is quite old data from the South American Championships in 1995. And most of that activity will be covered in what we call submaximal activities such as jogging and walking. When we look at the high intensity work, there's not very much goes on there, but it's very important to the outcome of the game. So for a long time now, we've understood very broadly what happens in a football game and the energetic requirements placed on players. But nowadays, with much more modern systems, we can get a lot of sophisticated information. In the UK now, especially in the Premier League, there's not many top clubs that won't have access to really detailed, sophisticated 8-camera systems. This gives us a little bit of information about how these systems work. So 8 cameras are positioned in the stands. They're permanently positioned there, so they're not manned by anyone, they're automated cameras. And these 8 cameras cover every single blade of grass on the pitch. Lots of clever computer software integrate those 8 camera signals, and we can get information on the work rate and the technical demands of all 22 players in the game at any one time. So this is an incredibly powerful scientific tool, as well as a useful applied tool for coaches, as we can get the detailed information on players' work rates for everyone at the same point, which is useful to understand how the team plays, not just how individual plays. So using this type of sophisticated system, then we can start to really look at those activity profiles in a lot more detail. So you won't be able to see this, but you can see now that we actually can split the activity now, not just into sprinting, but into specific types of sprinting. We can also start to classify the activity that is done with and without the ball. So rather than those kind of broad classifications that we've used maybe for the last 10 or 15 years, we can now get much more detailed information on what players do in games, which is really useful for the training process. Let's think about how we use that data then, because that is important. It's no good just having information on players if we're not actually going to try and use it. And in my mind, there are 2 groups of end users for this type of stuff. There's the coaches, and there's also the scientists. Now for me, if I'm working in a football club, if the information can't be included in the coaching process to ultimately go back and improve performance, then there doesn't seem to be a lot of point in recording that data. And I believe that especially in the English Premier League at the minute, there is far too much random data collection going on without anyone using that, which I think is a big problem. This type of work rate data, though, is also used by scientists, and it's used by scientists to actually look at the effectiveness of their interventions. So there have been a number of papers out there in the literature that have looked at changes in an individual's work rate following a specific training intervention, which then try and make assumptions about how effective that training intervention is. Now, I just thought I'd show you this data because I think that there are potentially big problems with using performance-based data either in an applied context or as a scientist in order to evaluate your study. And really some of those problems come back to this information here. This is a paper that was lead authored by Warren Gregson, who's sitting in the audience at the minute, and it was based on around 500 Premier League players. Now, as I said before, 20 years ago, we didn't get access to huge sample sizes because the nature of collecting performance analysis data was very time consuming, but the new systems remove that pressure from us. So we can look at big samples. And what we can also do is look at the same performance of any one player over a given season or a given period of games. What that allows us to do is to evaluate the variability in that performance. And understanding that variability is very important to actually determining if that individual is able to consistently perform across a game, or if a change as a consequence of an intervention is meaningful. Now let's just look at some of the variation in some of these variables here. So total high-speed running has a coefficient of variation of around 18%. Total sprint number has a coefficient of variation of around 30%. Now, for a scientific instrument that's pretty accurate, we'd probably be looking for variance of less than 5 to 10%. So for me, what players do in games is incredibly inconsistent. So actually, using a match as a performance model on which to evaluate something like a training intervention is a very difficult thing to do. Now, until we have a view of, I want to go and play golf in the afternoon, or has got a shopping trip organised with his wife, then maybe the